evening and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. Tonight, an idea whose time has passed. The Planning Commission is now soon to be consigned to the dustbin of history. The big question, what will be its new avatar? Planning a new commission. That's our focus on the show tonight. And joining me tonight is a panel of politicians plus 4 experts, all of them who've been part of the old Planning Commission. As we look at the new avatar, with me tonight is Rajiv Pratap Rudy, BJP General Secretary and MP. I'm also joined by Manish Tiwari, former Minister for Information and Broadcasting. Also with me, Professor Kirit Parekh. He's been the member of many Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Councils. He's also been a member of the Planning Commission. Also with me, Professor Y.K. Alag, former Minister, former member of the Planning Commission. He's now Professor Emeritus at the Sardar Patel Institute in Ahmedabad. Joining me also, Sudha Pillai, former Member Secretary of the Planning Commission, and Arun Maira, former member of the Planning Commission. Thank you all very much for coming in tonight. Mr. Rudy, I'll begin with you because it's your government which took this decision. And many, of course, at that time remembered the time when Mr. Modi as Chief Minister had come to Delhi and had given a presentation to the Planning Commission about how unfair he felt it was that a body sitting in Delhi should decide the priorities of how states should spend their funds. It's that thinking which drove his passionate appeal or speech where he made the point that we really have to begin this Planning Commission to construct a whole new building. But what's the vision for that whole new building beyond the speech, beyond what he outlined, which we know bits and pieces of? What is the central vision of this new commission?
Well, I would not exactly know what prompted Mr. Modi and the Prime Minister to speak what he's talking about the Planning Commission now. But what I can understand is we have come to government with a reasonably good mandate and there is an appetite. Whether the present appetite this appetite can be taken care of by the existing recipe or we need a new one. And I think if you look into many things, as Manish comes down and he says, look, I got stuck up in a traffic jam, and the conversation begins like that. Making roads in this country is no rocket science. But to plan it out and to see that the people have actually access to roads and planned roads for next 50 years. For example, if I have to explain a commoner why we say that this, whether it's a political system and when Planning Commission has come into its reference now. Well, in this country, we have not been 100 years ago, the Britishers came 150 years ago and they created the Luton's Delhi. We staying here, the planners of this country, have not been able to replicate one. So we are not talking about rocket science, we are talking about application. So I do not know, and I can get into more figures and facts to say that there was an institution called the Parliament and there was an institution called the government and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister chairs the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission should have been a reference point to plan things as the word sounds. But they got confined for over the last 50 years, planning for 5 years, which no government is 5 years. There have been ups and downs in the governments. Some governments have lasted lesser. And then, of course, the ancillaries of the Finance Commission and devolution of money to the states. And what personally, if I have to think back, what a Babu in the Finance Ministry was doing was exactly what the Planning Commission was doing here. So it was a multiplicity of tasks, which possibly it was very difficult to explain what actually, now retrospectively, it may have worked good for the first 5 years, maybe next 10 years. But beyond that, looking retrospectively, today, the reference point of the Planning Commission is become rather blurred. And possibly all this, so we can come into examples, many more examples why it may have worked, it may have outlived its utility now, and that's why the Prime Minister, with the mandate, he thinks, let's make the best use of it. A, there is a view would scrap it. B, it is remodify it, remodel it, revision it. And I think government of the day with the mandate which it has must look into things on a newer perspective, and that is where I believe is the change.
Manish Tiwari, the feeling that the Planning Commission may well have outlived its utility came up under the UPA as well. You had various UPA ministers attack it, Kamal Nath famously calling it an armchair advisor, saying nothing, when an international airport was being inaugurated, he said it wouldn't have been done if the Planning Commission was in charge. So you've had these clashes before. The Prime Minister also had issued strong statements on how the Planning Commission needs to reinvent itself. Yet, in the UPA, the main problem was implementation, and now there seems opposition to a decision just for the sake of opposition.
Well, Sonia, I think the fundamental question which needs to be answered is, has the Planning Commission outlived its utility? Have we come to a final conclusion that the Planning Commission has outlived its utility? So therefore, if the government thinks that the Planning Commission has outlived its utility, they must come out with cogent reasons, explaining and articulating as to how the Planning Commission has really or needs to be consigned to the dustbin, the words that you used. Number two, do they intend replacing it with a new institution, or they just intend doing away with the institution? That is the second question which needs to be answered. So therefore, before possibly throwing this in the public domain in a very, very cavalier manner, the government should have thought it through and decided that A, do we want to have a public debate on this issue? B, or we've already made up our mind and this is the conclusion that we've come to. Unfortunately, we've seen neither of that. So therefore, the moot point is that it is very easy to be the demolition man. It is very easy to be the slayer of institutions, but it is very difficult to create institutions. So therefore, if you want to renew the institution, you should have a game plan. If you want to junk the institution, you need to articulate the reasons for doing so. And unfortunately, we have heard neither at this stage. So therefore, it's a very amorphous, abstract construct, which unfortunately has not been fleshed out.
Let me bring in Professor Alag, because Professor Alag was actually part of the consultations you held with experts this week on what the new look, the new avatar of the Planning Commission should be. Professor Alag, I know you can't talk about what actually happened in the meetings, but with your experience, sir, over the years, both as being part of union government, as being part of the Planning Commission, what do you think is central for a new Planning Commission and taking should a game plan be already in place, or should it actually be, and we know that it's been opened up to the people of India who can actually write in a website with their suggestions as well. What do you think a new Planning Commission should be like?
Sonia, the whole question of the reform of the Planning Commission and newer kinds of planning apparatuses have been talked about, at least for about 2 decades now, and most certainly during the last decade. And I think basically the kind of questions that have been raised and the direction in which we are moving is one, that policies since the reform of the early 90s are far more important than resource allocation by the state with a kind of command economy apparatus. And so the allocation of funds to the different ministries as well as to the different states. Now, some of it is done by the Finance Commission, that is revenue. But the capital part for investment projects is done through Article 282 and Article 285. Now that, there has to be a process behind it. Okay, even if one says that the central ministries will follow the directives of the Prime Minister's office, but the states will not, and therefore you had this thing that when it was said that the Planning Commission is going to be abolished, the Bengal government said, hey, because basically the states get money from the government of India for development purposes at present through the Planning Commission. So they have a kind of history and a stake in that process. They come, they discuss, they always complain, the Planning Commission doesn't know what it is doing, we don't get enough funds. At the same time, there is a history. Now, when you talk about reform, when you say that public expenditure will be far more focused, we will be only talking about major priorities, energy, water, land and agriculture,
yes,
then your focus is far more limited than what it was earlier. Now, that is one direction of reform. The other is a reorientation with policies. Now, this has been talked about, and this is the direction in which we want to move. So it's not as if something new has come about all of a sudden, but it is true that the present government has said, yes, we want to do this.
And I think it's that intent which is key. But Professor Parekh, when we come into the contours of that intent, because I think much of the opposition to the Planning Commission in its current form has been of it, and in fact the Independent Evaluation Office in its report which came out on the 29th of May described it as a monolithic allocator of financial resources. It said it had no constitutional mandate, and in fact this Independent Evaluation Office recommended that the Planning Commission be abolished and its staff return to their parent cadre. It's this whole feeling of the Planning Commission being this kind of fiscal police controlling funds, and the whole issue of looking at policy, looking at reform has kind of been consigned to the background.
I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I wouldn't say that Planning Commission was controlling everyone's allocations and what they are doing. But on the margin, yes, it did have some impact on how states spent their money. But states had lots of freedom in some sense. But I think what one should really think about is look at the history of the Planning Commission. It was set up in 1950. At that time, if you had looked back in the globally, previous 30 years, Soviet Union in 30 years from a very agrarian economy had become through central planning a global power. I would argue that almost all economists in the world, not just India, around the world, would have said that for India a planned development program is the most essential one. And therefore, I think the first 15 years or 20 years, Planning Commission played a very useful role in setting the contours of development of this country. Of course, we made a mistake afterwards. We became too inward looking. We did not open up when we should have. At 1991, after the reforms, the question comes now, Planning Commission is no longer allocating these resources. So what's the role? But I think one has to recognize what Professor Lakdawala, one former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, said, that Planning Commission is the only lobby of the poor, for the poor in the country. Otherwise, each ministry, each department would just go on its own, protecting its own turf or enlarging it and so on. Somebody has to have a vision, and a vision document for the country, a vision for how development will take place, I think is critical. One has to, and many development like infrastructure, roads, railways, power sector, they all require a long-term perspective. They take long gestation period, and you need to have a vision. For example, energy policy. You cannot just say that 10 years from now I will start nuclear power program and not do anything today about it. So I think you need to program. In many of these cases, actions you must take sufficiently in time, and further you need a longer term vision, a vision that encompasses not just the interest of few ministries but the people as a whole. So if you want to have a vision for inclusive development, you ought to have some kind of a body which provides that vision, which explores policies and options on a fact based, on science based, on data based analysis. And that is what is required to give options of where we can go, what are the alternatives that we have, and how we should go about developing the country.
It's ironical you said that, because in fact the most flack the Planning Commission got in the recent tenure of the UPA was about it actually how it dealt with issues facing the poor. We remember the whole controversy over poverty figures, and in fact even Rahul Gandhi at that point had said that the Planning Commission is not in touch with ground realities. You had the controversy when P. Sainath did that article on how much the Planning Commission spent on renovating toilets and went around giving a poverty line of 32 rupees a day. So in that sense, the Planning Commission has come to be seen as a symbol of an elite group which is not dealing with the ground realities of the poor. I mean, one of the failures when people talk about planning of India has been that why our social indicators, whether it's health, whether it's child mortality, are so low despite the fact that our GDP was high.
But I think what we are hearing is that the Planning Commission has been doing many things, and it's not clear to people what exactly is the value it's adding. So we are muddling around, the Planning Commission seems to be muddling around, and the country is quite muddled about what this body does for the country. So this is the fact that we have to now sharpen. Do we need an institution at the center? I think the Prime Minister did say, as we heard the speech, not that we're consigning this thing away and nothing in its place. He said there's going to be a new body, new soul, new thinking. And so what is...
New name as well.
And a new name, which is the last thing. But first, what does it do? And the name should suit what it does. So what do we want a body at the center to do in this day and age? The word planning is a good word. At all times, all systems need a plan. And Soviet Union needs a plan. The US is saying it needs plans for its infrastructure today. It's crumbling. Needs plans to create jobs in industry. They're not generating. So they would have to have in their democratic entrepreneurial setup some way for that system to make a plan to get all the actions going towards achieving those goals, including energy security. They've had one there. So we have to modernize the way we plan. And in India, which has got the energy of the states, and when you talk about the poor, it's not just the Planning Commission's perspective on looking after the poor. Surely the states also are concerned about the poor in their states. So it's not that you have to come and appeal to us and then we'll tell the state how to look after you. I mean, this is a wrong mindset, I would say. So it has to be helping whoever are the agencies who have the authority and the resources like the states have to do what they want to do. And I heard Mr. Modi when he came to the Planning Commission, this is precisely what he was saying. Can you add value to us? Can you help us? We do want to do a good job for our citizens in our states. The ministries have been saying the same thing, that your authority exceeds your capability. You have authority to control the schemes we have and the money that you allocate to us, but your capability to help us to be effective is not matching the authority you have. So we have a position where there's an institution whose authority, in effect, exceeds its capability to add value in the processes in which it's interacting with the various other agencies and stakeholders in the country.
So is it about bad visioning or bad communication? What's the problem? Let me bring in the person who was really involved in the nitty-gritty in a sense of implementation or looking at these details, Ms. Sudha Pillai, former Member Secretary of the Planning Commission. Ms. Pillai, you've heard the discussion so far. Your perspective on what you think are the key points, and again the various reports on what the new Planning Commission may be like. It's going to be much more on think tank mode. It's a various its current powers may be hived off, whether it's to the Finance Commission, whether it's to the National Development Council. It's all a bit unclear at the moment. What do you think is the most practical, feasible way forward?
As you said, I've been on both sides of the table. In 2008, during a budget discussion, in fact, I and another secretary to government told the finance minister that but for Planning Commission we would grow at 12%. That is because Planning Commissions moved away from the macro to the micro. Its original intent was not to give individual clearances for proposals of the ministries which had actually been announced by the government in the budget speech. In fact, I had a very tough time getting a scheme for skill development off the ground, and it took me 8 months and several visits to the Planning Commission as Labour Secretary to do something about skill development. That is actually, so when I took over as Secretary in the Planning Commission and later as Member Secretary, I was always trying to hasten the process of giving clearances to the Ministry's proposals. But I don't see why Planning Commission should be looking at individual proposals. And I would say, there's a small little core of what good the Planning Commission has done over the years, and that is, I think, in the very deprived areas of our country. I would remind people of Kalahandi, which but for the special program for Kalahandi districts, you know, what we call the KBK districts, would have been in a really bad shape even today. We also had program for Bundelkhand. We have done something, I think, worthwhile in the areas which are affected by Naxalism, and that is actually part of the original mandate of the Planning Commission. So what I would say is there's a lot of bathwater, there's a lot of murky, dirty bathwater, and a lot of interference in the work of the ministries, lot of, I would say, rival centers of power which actually began to grow over a period of time. But lurking within that dirty, murky bathwater, there's a small baby. And I also want to say that this baby needs to be kept, and this baby is the issue of macro issues, of resources. What kind of resources are we looking at? Human resources, money, land. Who is going to actually look at these macro issues and ensure that we are not suddenly surprised by the fact that we don't have enough doctors or engineers or teachers? I think we have a problem today. And my feeling is that Planning Commission did not look at these issues all these years. They were too busy clearing individual files. That's, I think, not the role of the Planning Commission. And I would just like to add that while the Planning Commission was created on the 15th of March 1950, there is a Ministry of Planning, and there are 2 separate entries in the allocation of business rules. Entry number 26 is for the Ministry of Planning, which I think is accountable to the Parliament. In fact, the statement says that the Ministry of Planning is responsible to the Parliament in relation to matters concerning national planning. Now we have to see whether we want any national planning. But if we want any national planning, then possibly the ministry would continue with the minister and the secretary.
So,
but the Planning Commission, whether it should be a think tank or a think tank plus, I think I think the thinking process is going on, and maybe in a short period of time we would know where we are going on that.